You know his name, Richard the Lionheart, the golden-haired king, the warrior who fought Saladin for Jerusalem, the hero of 1,000 legends. For 800 years his name has meant one thing: courage. Poets sang of his valor. Children grew up hearing tales of his noble crusade. He's been immortalized as the perfect Christian knight, brave, honorable, unbreakable. But on August 20th, 1191, under a scorching Middle Eastern sun, this legendary king stood on a hill outside the city of Ara and gave an order that would echo through history as one of the most horrifying war crimes ever committed. What happened next was so brutal, so calculated, so utterly devoid of mercy, that even his mortal enemy, Saladin, a man who had witnessed decades of medieval warfare, was moved to tears of rage and disbelief. Nearly 3,000 unarmed prisoners, men, women, and children, who had surrendered under a promise of safety, all bound with ropes, all marched to their deaths in full view of their own army. And for hours the Crusaders' swords rose and fell, until the ground ran red and the screams finally stopped. This is the story the history books don't want to teach. This is the day the hero became the monster. This is the massacre, and also known as, before we understand the massacre, we need to understand the man. Because Richard the Lionheart wasn't born a hero. He was forged into something far more dangerous. Richard was born in 1157, the third son of King Henry II of England and Helena of Aquitaine, arguably the most powerful woman in Europe. From birth, Richard wasn't destined for the English throne. That honor belonged to his older brother. But Richard's mother had other plans. She recognized something in him that his father never did: a capacity for absolute ruthlessness disguised as martial brilliance. Helena gave Richard control of Aquitaine when he was just a teenager, and he immediately showed what he was capable of. When local barons rebelled against his rule, Richard didn't just defeat them. He crushed them so thoroughly, so viciously, that the violence became legendary. He would storm castles, execute prisoners, and burn whole villages to send a message. This wasn't just about winning. This was about making people fear him so much they would never dare to rebel again. By his early 22s, Richard had developed a reputation that terrified even his own family. He was physically imposing, over 6 feet tall in an era when most men barely reached 5'1" over 2 feet. Contemporary accounts describe him as powerfully built with reddish blonde hair and pale blue eyes that seemed to look through people. One chronicler wrote that when Richard entered a room, men felt winter in their bones. But here's what makes Richard truly disturbing. He was brilliant tactically, strategically. He was perhaps the finest military mind of his generation. He could read a battlefield like others read books. He understood logistics, siege warfare, naval operations, and psychological warfare in ways that wouldn't be matched for centuries. He was fluent in several languages. He was a talented musician and poet. This wasn't some mindless brute. This was an educated, refined, cultured man who chose violence as his primary language. In 1189, Richard did something that shocked medieval Europe. He went to war against his own father. King Henry II was old, sick, and weak, and Richard wanted the crown. He allied with his father's greatest enemy, King Philip II of France, and systematically dismantled his father's power. They chased Henry from castle to castle, cutting him off from supplies and support. When Henry finally died, broken and defeated, and according to some sources, cursing Richard with his last breath, Richard showed no remorse whatsoever. At his father's funeral, Richard didn't weep. He didn't pray. According to witnesses, he stood over the body with a face like stone, then turned and walked away to claim his crown. One observer wrote, "There was something in his eyes that day that was not quite human." Richard spent exactly 6 months in England as king, 6 months out of a 10-year reign. Why? Because England to Richard was nothing more than a massive piggy bank. He famously said, "I would sell London itself if I could find a buyer." He wasn't joking. he systematically stripped England of wealth, selling titles, lands, and positions to anyone who could pay. He raised taxes to crushing levels. He emptied the treasury, all for one purpose: to fund his crusade. Because in 1187, something had happened that sent shockwaves through Christian Europe. Saladin, the brilliant Kurdish-born Sultan of Egypt and Syria, had done the unthinkable. After decades of Crusader occupation, he had recaptured Jerusalem. The holiest city in Christendom had fallen to Muslim forces. Pope Urban III reportedly died of shock when he heard the news. Across Europe, the call went out: reclaim Jerusalem, launch a new crusade. And Richard heard that call like it was destiny itself speaking his name. This was what he had been training for his entire life. This was his chance to become legend. This was his ticket to immortality. But as Richard prepared his crusade, something dark was growing inside him, something that went beyond normal medieval brutality. His chaplain and biographer, a man who traveled with him, would later write something chilling in his private notes, notes that wouldn't be discovered for centuries. My lord, the king possessed a great gift for war, but it came with a terrible cost. He did not see his enemy eyes as men. To him, they were obstacles to be removed, like trees to be cut down or stones to be cleared from a path. And he removed them with the same emotion a farmer might have for pulling weeds. This was the man who would sail east to fight for Jerusalem. Not a noble knight, not a hero from a song, but a brilliant, calculating, ruthless warrior who viewed human life as a commodity to be spent in pursuit of glory. And he was about to meet the one opponent who was his equal in every way. To understand what made the massacre so shocking, you need to understand who witnessed it, because standing in his camp across from that hill, watching Richard's atrocity unfold, was a man who represented everything Richard pretended to be but wasn't. Sultan Salah ad-Din Yusuf Naub, the man we know as Saladin. Saladin's reputation in both Muslim and Christian sources is almost unprecedented. This was a man who fought the Crusaders for decades, who recaptured Jerusalem after 90 years of Christian occupation, and yet was so renowned for his honor and mercy that even his enemies wrote poems about his nobility. Christian chroniclers described him as a prince among pagans and worthy of Christian baptism. When Saladin retook Jerusalem in 1187, he could have massacred every Christian in the city. The Crusaders had slaughtered thousands of Muslims and Jews when they first captured Jerusalem in 1099. But Saladin didn't. He offered terms. Those who could pay a ransom could leave safely. When he saw elderly Christian women weeping because they couldn't afford the ransom, he freed them. When Christian wives begged for their imprisoned husbands, he released them. When orphans cried at the gates, he gave them money from his own treasury. Richard saw war as a tool for personal glory. Saladin saw it as a necessary evil to reclaim Muslim lands. Richard was willing to use any method to win. Saladin was constantly trying to maintain his honor even in victory. They were military equals, but moral opposites. And now they were about to collide at the Siege of Acre. The Siege of Acre is often called the most brutal siege of the Middle Ages. It began in August 1189, when Crusader forces laid siege to this vital port city. But Saladin immediately surrounded the Crusader army with his own forces, so the Crusaders were besieging Acre while simultaneously being besieged themselves. It became a hellish stalemate where everyone was trapped and dying slowly. The conditions defy imagination. Disease swept through like wildfire. Bodies piled up faster than they could be buried. The smell of death hung over everything. Food ran out, then clean water ran out. Men began dying of scurvy, their teeth falling out, their wounds refusing to heal, their bodies literally rotting while they still lived. The Muslim garrison inside Acre was slowly starving, eating their horses, then leather and rats. For 2 years this went on. Conservative estimates suggest 100,000 people died at Acre. That's more than the population of most medieval cities dead at one siege. And then, in June 1191, everything changed. Ships appeared on the horizon, massive war gees flying the royal banner of England. Richard the Lionheart had finally arrived. Richard hit Acre like a hurricane. He brought fresh troops, massive siege engines, and gold. Within days, he had reorganized the siege. His new trebuchets and catapults began a systematic bombardment. Day and night the stones flew. The walls began to crumble. Despite getting sick with fever, Richard commanded from his sick bed, even having himself carried to the walls on a stretcher to personally shoot at defenders with his crossbow. By early July, the garrison inside Acre knew it was over. They negotiated a surrender. On July 12, 1191, after 23 months of hell, the siege was finally over. But the terms of that surrender would set the stage for one of history's greatest atrocities. The deal was this. Saladin would pay a massive ransom, around 200,000 gold ENRs. He would release 1,500 to 2,000 Christian prisoners, and he would return the true cross, the relic supposedly from Christ's crucifixion. In exchange, Richard would spare the lives of the garrison, between 2,700 and 3,000 men, women, and children. They would become hostages. The deadline was set, August 20th, 6 weeks. From the beginning, the deal was poisoned by mutual distrust. Saladin began gathering the ransom money, but collecting that much gold took time. He started rounding up Christian prisoners, but gathering them all required weeks. He sent emissaries showing proof of progress. But Richard kept finding reasons to reject partial payments. The true cross first. Richard demanded the golden prisoners first. Saladin countered. Back and forth it went, each side demanding the other act first. The hostages were kept in terrible conditions, packed into buildings, given minimal food and water. Richard grew increasingly agitated. He needed to move his army south toward Jerusalem. Every day spent at Acre was a day wasted. His soldiers were growing restless. But August 20th came. The full terms had not been met. The deadline passed and Richard made a decision. August 20th, 1191 dawned hot and clear. Richard held a council with his commanders. Some allegedly argued for patience, others counsel-settled compromise. But Richard had made up his mind. The prisoners were a drain on resources. They were a security risk. But more than that, he wanted to send a message. He wanted every Muslim force between Acre and Jerusalem to know that Richard Plantagenet was not bound by the normal rules of war, that mercy was not in his vocabulary. So Richard gave the order the prisoners would be executed. All of them. That morning, Crusader soldiers entered the compounds where the hostages were held. "You're being moved," they told them. "Saladin has paid the ransom. You're going home." The prisoners were lined up, bound with ropes in long columns. Then they were marched out of Acre's gates to a small hill about a mile from the city, a hill called Ayadir, a hill clearly visible from Saladin's camp. When the Muslim army saw the column of prisoners being led toward the hill, they knew something was wrong. Saladin himself rode forward to watch. The prisoners reached the hill. Crusader soldiers surrounded them. The prisoners were forced to kneel, and then they understood this wasn't a prisoner transfer. This was an execution ground. The panic must have been unimaginable. 3,000 people bound together, kneeling in the sand, watching Crusader soldiers draw their swords, mothers clutching children, men praying, everyone screaming. Saladin realized what was about to happen and ordered his cavalry to charge to try to save the prisoners. But his commanders stopped him. It was suicide. The Crusaders were ready. Any cavalry charge would be cut down before reaching the hostages. Saladin, one of history's greatest military minds, was forced to sit on his horse and watch powerless as Richard committed mass murder. What happened next is described in horrifying detail by multiple chroniclers. The Muslim historian Bahar Alim ibn Shad was in Saladin's camp and witnessed it. When the order was given, the Crusader soldiers moved in. This wasn't done in rage. This was systematic, efficient, industrial. The prisoners were bound and kneeling. They couldn't fight back. They couldn't run. They could only wait for the blade. Baha Alim wrote, "The Franks, on whom be God's curse, then flung themselves upon them all at once, and massacred them with sword and lance in cold blood. Our soldiers looked on from the heights, And when they saw how the Muslims were being slaughtered and heard their cries for help, they nearly went out of their minds with grief and rage. It took hours. The Crusader soldiers moved methodically through the kneeling prisoners, killing systematically. Some soldiers grew tired and had to be relieved by fresh troops. A few prisoners were spared, about 200 wealthy individuals who could still be ransomed or young men who could be used as slave labor, but the rest were killed. All of them. Men, women, children, elderly, no exceptions. From his camp, Saladin watched it all. Multiple sources describe him weeping openly. This hardened warrior reduced to tears by the sheer magnitude of the atrocity. His men were crying, screaming, some trying to charge forward, only to be held back. The sounds coming from that hill were inhuman. The screaming was deafening, and it went on for hours. Richard himself watched the massacre. He didn't participate directly, but he was present, sitting on his horse, observing as his orders were carried out. Some chroniclers report he showed no emotion whatsoever. Others claim he appeared satisfied, as if watching the successful completion of a necessary task. By sunset, it was over. Nearly 3,000 bodies lay on that hill. Saladin's response was immediate. The man known for his mercy now gave an order that matched Richard's atrocity. Every Christian prisoner in his custody, hundreds, perhaps more than 1,000, was to be executed. No exceptions. It was done swiftly. An eye for an eye, a massacre for a massacre. But Saladin later expressed deep regret. His personal secretary recorded him saying, "I have stained my soul to answer Richard's crime. But if I had not, my men would have lost all faith in my ability to protect them." Even in his revenge, Saladin understood he was betraying his own principles. The true cross was never recovered. The massacre fundamentally changed the Third Crusade. Before Acre, there had been a possibility of negotiated settlement. After Acre, that possibility died. The war became viciously personal. Quarter was rarely given. Prisoners faced execution or torture. The cycle of violence that Richard initiated would continue for decades. Richard's crusade continued. His army marched south and fought the Battle of Ars, winning decisively against Saladin. After that, Crusader forces took the fortress of Jaffa. When the garrison surrendered, Richard initially accepted. Then, days later, he claimed they had violated the terms. His response, he executed the entire garrison. Hundreds more dead at his command. Yet for all his military brilliance, Richard never recaptured Jerusalem. He got close. Twice his army camped within sight of the city, but both times he turned back. Here's the irony. If Richard had kept the agreement at Acre, if he had shown mercy and patience, he might have been able to negotiate a peaceful entry into Jerusalem. Saladin was pragmatic, but after the massacre, no compromise was possible. Richard had burned that bridge himself. In September 1192, Richard finally negotiated a truce with Saladin. The Treaty of Jaffa gave the Crusaders a strip of coastline and guaranteed Christian pilgrims safe passage to Jerusalem. It was reasonable, but far less than Richard had come for. He had set out to recapture Jerusalem. He would leave without it. Richard's journey home was almost as dramatic as his crusade. He tried to take a shortcut through Central Europe, but was captured by Duke Leopold V, a man Richard had insulted during the Siege of Acre. Richard spent more than a year imprisoned, held for ransom 150,000 marks, roughly 3 times England's annual revenue. The irony is perfect. Richard, who had murdered 3,000 prisoners rather than wait for ransom, was himself a prisoner waiting for ransom. In 1199, while besieging a minor French castle over a trivial dispute, Richard was shot by a crossbow bolt. The wound became infected, and 12 days later, Richard the Lionheart died in agony, aged just 41. The castle was held by just a few dozen defenders. One defender, Bertrand de Gordel, fired almost at random, and his bolt struck Richard in the shoulder. As Richard lay dying, he pardoned Bertrand and ordered him released. But the moment Richard died, His men ignored his final order and flayed Bertrand alive anyway. Even Richard's one act of mercy was undone by the culture of violence he had created. Today, 800 years later, Richard the Lionheart remains one of history's most famous kings. There are statues of him in London. He appears in countless movies, books, and legends. He's usually portrayed as the hero, brave, noble, the righteous Christian warrior. But this is the sanitized version, the legend scrubbed clean of blood. The real Richard was something far more complex and far more disturbing. He was brilliant, probably the finest military commander of his era. He was brave. His personal courage is undeniable. But he was also a monster who committed one of medieval history's most infamous war crimes. The Massacre at Acre stands as a stark reminder that history's heroes are often nothing of the sort, that the names we celebrate often belong to people who did unconscionable things, that glory in war often means atrocity in practice. Nearly 3,000 people died on that hill outside Acre. They had surrendered under a promise of safety. They were unarmed, bound, and helpless. And they were slaughtered on the orders of a king who wanted to send a message that Richard the Lionheart was a man without mercy, that he valued efficiency over honor, that to him, human life was just another resource to be expended in pursuit of victory. Even Saladin recognized that Richard had crossed a line that shouldn't be crossed. After Acre, one of Saladin's advisors asked him why he seemed so troubled by Richard specifically. Saladin replied, "The others are warriors. Richard is something else, something darker. When you look into his eyes, you see no bottom, just an endless hunger for glory, no matter the cost in blood. That is not a warrior. That is a beast in human form." History remembers Richard as the Lionheart, but perhaps that name is more accurate than the poets intended, because on August 20th, 1191, Richard didn't act like a man. He acted exactly like a lion, a predator who killed efficiently and without mercy, who saw his prey not as living beings, but as meat. The name Lionheart speaks of courage and strength, but it also speaks of a creature that kills without conscience, without remorse, without humanity. And that might be the most honest thing anyone ever said about Richard Plantagenet, King of England, the man who ordered 3,000 prisoners massacred and never lost a single night's sleep over it. The massacre at Acre changed the Third Crusade and left a stain on history that can never be washed away.